you wrote a study actually that said that people who were more sensual, more curious, had more imagination, even outside the bedroom, tended to have better sex. Tell me a little bit about that study.
Yeah, so this was kind of the first study I did that kind of set the foundation for the book. Because in just talking to clients over the years and people who were struggling in different ways with their sex lives, I started to notice kind of some patterns emerge. And I did feel that people, we've talked a lot about sensuality so far, people who were more in touch with the senses were more sexually satisfied. That was backed up with the data. People who were more curious, who didn't stop asking questions. And I studied this because there was research out there looking at the benefits of curiosity. And you would hear sex therapists talk about the importance of curiosity, but there just wasn't a whole lot of data linking the two, which is why, I'm very evidence-based and I needed some numbers. And so I administered a questionnaire looking specifically at curiosity, almost as a trait, kind of a personality trait in people, and found that yes, they were more likely to report greater levels of satisfaction. What was interesting though is people could score high on curiosity, high on sensuality, imagination, those sort of things. But if they were not in a secure relationship, if they felt unsafe in their relationship for any way, emotionally, physically, you name it, sexual satisfaction scores plummeted. So I think having a really, healthy, secure relationship is also a very important, piece of the puzzle, which is what the vulnerability chapter is all about. But yes, we found that yes, a lot of this starts outside the bedroom and then that energy kind of translates in. That's what I think makes the curiosity chapter really exciting because, a lot of people hear about how important it is to try new things in bed. And we know this from the research. Yes, novelty is a key for sexual satisfaction long term, but not always in the way people think of it. There's an interesting area of research looking at self-expansion where when we do something new as an individual or especially as part of a couple, like there was this one study where they gave couples new things like shucking an oyster for the first time. Like they were 36 times more likely to have sex that day than couples who didn't try something new. It was like not twice as likely, like it was pretty much guaranteed. And I think,
Wow.
for people who are feeling kind of like things have gotten monotonous, predictable, boring, like read the curiosity chapter, because that's where it's all about kind of opening the mind, tapping into fantasy, again, pulling from flow state science. One of the best predictors of flow is striking the right balance between challenge and skills. So if you imagine an XY axis with challenge on one side, skills on the other, on the X axis, let's say. And if the challenge of what you're doing is too high above your skill set, you'll feel anxious, scared, probably shut down, right? If the challenge of what you're doing is too far below your skill set, you'll feel bored. To get into flow, the challenge only needs to be 4% greater than your skills. That is not much, just 4%. I talked to one of my clients who I've been applying this work now to my clients for the past several years. And I wish this story had made it into the book, but the book was written by the time I worked with this client. But he said, I started trying to think more about that 4%. And typically we have sex in the missionary position, but I'm, supporting myself on my forearms. But what I did last night was I reached down with one hand and grabbed her, kind of held her hand. And then I used my other hand to like cup the back of her head. And like that was just novel enough that it drew their focus in. So, we are not talking about, whipping out the whips and chains and things like that. Like if you don't want to go from 0 to 60 when you're trying new things. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. So it's, looking at what you can do together as a couple outside of the bedroom that's different. That alone will create a sense of novelty, I think, inside the bedroom. And then just being really subtle about what you do that's different can pack a real major punch.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think I think that it's just these small tweaks that can make a huge difference. But also, I think realizing that if you try something new and it's challenging, like, yes, there may be some frustration with it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying it if that's something you want to, right? Because as you keep trying it, your skill will improve, and that gap between challenge and skill will continue to decrease. So I think, like, yeah, say your goal is to try something totally outside the box that you've never done before. Realize the first time is going to be frustrating. Like, you're going to try it and you're going to be frustrated. Your partner's going to be frustrated, but like, it's okay. And I always say this, sex is play, right? Like, it's okay. You make mistakes. You're going to learn. You're going to have fun with it. It doesn't have to be so serious and rigid.
I love that. And I could not agree more. For some reason, like, no, we would never say we don't like a kind of cuisine without giving it a sample, or a type of music without listening to it first. But for some reason, when it comes to trying new things in bed, like, someone will give an idea and there's this automatic, like, oh, I would never do that, or I would never like that kind of reaction. Part of the curiosity chapter is being curious about our automatic reactions. Like, when you have a strong kind of disgust or surprise reaction to something your partner shares, you want to be curious about where that feeling is coming from. Like, ask yourself what thoughts are attached to that feeling. What evidence do you have that might change your thought? And can you replace it with a more balanced thought? And how does that change your feelings? And does it make you more inclined to give it a go? And yes, when we are learning something new, rarely are we masters the first time we do it. And we have to remember this when it comes to trying new things in bed. It takes a few times.
Yeah, it's a wonder to me. People think that sex should be automatic. Like, we should just know instinctually how to do it and we should know how to pleasure other people. But like, no, it's just like any other skill. Practice makes perfect. And each person is so individual. So it's with that individual person where, if you're in a long-term relationship, you will find that sex can be amazing because you've done it a lot with that person, as long as you sort of continue the curiosity, continue the novelty, and work on sensuality and all these things you discuss in the book, because desire is something you have to work at. It is not just like always going to be there.
Exactly, exactly. In the attunement chapter, it's all about getting in sync with your partner. And I use the analogy of like a pair of ballroom dancers who've been dancing together for years and who appear to move as one unit. And I think that's what a lot of couples want to feel, is like, it's not just them having sex with their partner. It's like they are kind of the gestalt of, two individuals coming together. The sum is bigger than the parts. But a lot of people feel kind of clunky, I think, when they're having sex, and it can feel a bit awkward. And usually that's because you're not doing it enough. Now, most of us don't have time, or it's not realistic to think you'll have sex every day necessarily. But when you've got long dry spells in between times that you're more sexual, it's going to be hard to, have that enough practice under your belt to get in sync and experience that sense of effortlessness that so many of us want.
Absolutely. So in the book, you talk about a sexual value system. So what is a sexual value system, and why should we know what ours is?
Yeah. So I think a lot of us don't realize how deeply we internalize ideas, beliefs that are put on us from, culture, society, family of origin, religion. And we take a lot of it for granted, compared to other behaviors in terms of or measures of health, rather, let's say, where there's a pretty kind of narrow range of normal when it comes to, like, let's take blood pressure, for instance. Like, there's a pretty narrow range of normal. When it comes to sex, it's like I said at the top of the episode, like, as long as there's mutual pleasure, mutual consent, anything goes. But a lot of us don't realize how narrow our ideas of what's quote unquote normal are. And so I have a questionnaire in the book about kind of picking apart your value system. So asking yourself questions like, what is the relationship between love and sex for me? How do I expect to be treated before, during, and after sex? This is stuff that I think a lot of us take for granted. Coming back to like the love and sex question, I think both men and women are brought up to decouple the idea of love and sex in a way. Like, on the one hand, people are taught, oh, save it for marriage when you are in love with someone and committed to that person. But because there is such a disconnect, I think, between teaching kids relationship skills and teaching kids sexual skills, the two concepts don't really end up kind of getting married to each other, if you will, as far as our ideas and understandings of those two things go. And what ends up happening is a lot of women kind of feel like sex is something they're doing for a man, or they don't think it's something that they will get as much pleasure from as male partners do. A lot of men don't even have the vocabulary to express to their female partners that sex is an opportunity for intimacy and connection for them. So what ends up happening is, stereotypically in heterosexual couples, the male partner will say, well, I want to have more sex. And they say it in a way, and it's understood by women in a way that kind of reads like, well, I just want to have more orgasms, or I need more physical pleasure. But really, it's about love and connection for them. And so I work a lot with both men and women on getting those two concepts to kind of overlap with one another so that they're seen as one and the same. That's, what the vulnerability chapter is all about. I think when we disconnect from the emotional element of sex, we're kind of reducing it down to just this juxtaposition of body parts and not really tapping into our full erotic potential as humans. So I think that's, just for example, a really important element that people need to spend some time thinking about.
You mentioned decoupling sex and love. So we learn about love from our parents. They're the first people who give us love. So how does that relationship then translate to how we perceive these two things together with our partners, depending on our relationships with our parents?
Well, for sure, the attachment style we have to our primary caregivers growing up informs the way we relate to our romantic partners as adults. So, to an extent, yes, the way our parents' relationship was with each other, the way love was modeled for us in terms of our parents' interaction can be a piece of the puzzle. But I think even deeper than that is the way our parents interacted with us. So, kind of the three buckets of attachment are people who have a secure attachment, people who have more of an anxious attachment. These people may over rely on sex to feel reassured in their relationship or to feel valued in their relationship. And pleasure can kind of fall by the wayside because they're not really connecting to it for that reason. People with more avoidant attachment styles tend to kind of tune their partner out and can pull back from that emotional piece because it almost feels too vulnerable for them to go there. And so I do write about attachment theory a little bit in the vulnerability section and kind of understanding how that translates into adulthood and specifically in the way we interact with our partners sexually. So I do think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You also mentioned that men don't have the vocabulary necessarily. And I find that that is a real challenge with my male patients is that, say they do go to sex therapy, they often feel like, well, my partner has all these words and she's able to really tell what she's feeling, and it makes me feel almost overrun, like I don't have much to add, or I feel like I'm not going to be heard because I can't really communicate it well. So how do you sort of balance that? Because I really want my male patients to feel like they're getting value from going to therapy. And I find that sometimes they really struggle and then they hear these stories and they feel nervous. And I think that's a challenge.
For sure. It's important for guys to know it's a developable skill. I think there's a bit of a disconnect right now in terms of, women have come a long way in learning to assert themselves, but men are kind of lagging behind, I think, in terms of their emotional IQ. And we're just now paying more attention to that, but I'll give my clients like a feelings cheat sheet where they can kind of look at it and be like, oh, okay, like that's what I'm experiencing right now because they just lack the vocabulary to express themselves emotionally. Or, sometimes it begins with kind of tuning into the sensation and the body that they're experiencing and then attaching a feeling word to that. And sometimes we start with just kind of the basic emotions, mad, sad, glad, right? And then from there, we can branch out into more descriptive terms. But yeah, I think specifically as it relates to sex, men need to give themselves permission and their female partners need to give them permission to say, hey, sex for me is not just about getting off. If it was, I could quite literally take matters into my own hands. For me, it's when I feel closest to you. It's not just about physical release. It's about intimacy. It's about connection. But I think a lot of men kind of shy away from even admitting that that's what it's about for them. I think that's also why it's important for men to feel desired by their partners or why it can feel so hurtful when their partner rejects them, because it doesn't just feel like they're rejecting a physical act. It feels personal because for them, it was an outreach of a loving connection that got dismissed. And oftentimes in kind of a rude, like, get off of me type of way. And so I'll work with my female partners on like saying what you mean without saying it mean, and understanding that for them it's personal. It's vulnerable to put yourself out there and say, hey, I want to share my body with you, because the idea of being rejected can be kind of painful.
If you enjoyed this clip from the Rena Malik MD podcast with Dr. Emily Jamea, make sure you check out the full video right here.